Thank you all for coming. We're very excited to have Evan Weiner here again today. He did a great program for us last year on 1968, 50 years later. Evan is a longtime sports journalist who's written columns in another number of newspapers, done radio programs and television, a special appearance on sports topics as well.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks for coming here today. I've been around this business since 1971. I started when I was 15 years old. And even though I'm talking mostly about the 1919 Chicago White Sox or Black Sox, I will also talk a little bit about Pete Rose. And I got to cover the Pete Rose, Bart Giamatti, Fay Vincent, John Dowd betting scandal, Paul Jansen's, all of them. That was back in 1989. And also talk just a little bit about basketball scandals because I knew Connie Hawkins, who was left out of the NBA until 1968, Roger Brown, who never played in the NBA, and yet both of them are in the Basketball Hall of Fame because they dealt with Jack Molinas, the gambler and fixer. But the Black Sox, it's the 100th anniversary of the throwing of the World Series. First World Series ever thrown, or was it? Maybe the 1918 World Series between the Cubs and Red Sox was also thrown. But before I get into all of that, baseball, professional baseball's been around since 1869 with the Cincinnati Reds. Red Stockings, as they were called back in those days. Lippman Pike was the first baseball player to get paid legally with the Philadelphia team in 1868. But there were scandals almost immediately. Now, the Black Sox is probably, with that and Pete Rose, the best known. Best of 9 World Series featuring the White Sox and the Reds, Cincinnati Reds, was fixed. How it happened? Well, we think we know what happened. We know that some of the players met with some gamblers. And all of a sudden, there was a promise, we'll give you this amount of money if you throw the World Series. There are various accounts of how that happened. We still don't know exactly 100 years later how that happened. It wasn't the first time that there was a fix. But the Chicago White Sox won 88 games that year. They were playing Cincinnati. Cincinnati was a good team, but the White Sox were favored. Now, everybody kind of knew that the World Series was fixed, but nobody did anything about it until 1920. A grand jury was seated for another fixed game during the 1920 season, and all of a sudden they stumbled upon, hey, the 1919 games were fixed. But it goes back. It goes back to the beginning of baseball. But here's the lineup. Chick Gendell, Eddie Cicotti, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Swede Risberg and Buck Weaver, Lefty Williams, Fred McMullen, Hap Flesh. All of them tossed out of baseball. They weren't the first ever tossed out of baseball. Early days of baseball, there was cricket play. That was not uncommon. Gamblers came around. In fact, they undermined the National Association in the 1870s. The National League was formed with the intent of let's get rid of gambling. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Tammany Hall, right? Tammany, who ran Tammany Hall? Who is that? Bosch Tweed. Well, Bosch Tweed was involved. Why wouldn't he be involved? He was the owner of the New York Mutuals in the 1860s, and that's where we find our first gambling, 1865. It involved the New York Mutuals, which was owned by Bosch Tweed. There were 3 players, Thomas Deaver, William Wansley, and Edward Duffy. They all claimed that they were victimized, a wicked conspiracy. They were banned because allegedly they took $100 each to throw a game against the Eckfords of Brooklyn in Hoboken, New Jersey. Now, wait a minute. Why are 2 New York teams playing in Hoboken? Elysian Fields. Eventually, the 3 of them would be reinstated. That's the first one. This guy, John Ratcliffe, he's the next guy who was caught. In 1874, he was thrown out of baseball. He offered an umpire $175 to help the Chicago White Stockings. The Chicago White Stockings. Hey, he was, 45 years early? Anyway, he offered the White Stockings $175 if he threw a game. Of course, he was gambling on the game. And then there's this guy, Bill Craver. He's part of the Louisville Grays. The Louisville Grays were the best team at that time. They had won 7 in a row. They were leading their league, the National League, and all of a sudden it was revealed that gamblers had bought off Craver, George Hall, Al Nichols, and Jim Devlin. The National League founder, William H. Hulbert, said, "You're gone. You're out of here. Banned from baseball." Now, the players claim that they only threw the games because they didn't get paid. Their owner just stiffed them. They did beg for forgiveness, but were never reinstated. Now, the Grays franchise was gone after 1877. Probably not because of the fix, probably because it was losing money. It lost $2,000. Over the next few decades, there were all kinds of suspicions of game fixing in baseball, including 1892. This guy, Dick Higham, he was a player who turned umpire, and the owner of the Detroit Wolverines at that time was William Thompson. And William Thompson became suspicious because all of a sudden there were all kinds of calls against his team. So he hires a detective to investigate what's going on, and then he finds out what's going on. Higham was corresponding with a gambler, and he had a simple code. If the gambler received a telegram from him, Higham, buy all the lumber you can, the gambler should bet on Detroit. If there was no telegram, then the gambler says, bet on your opponent. Lumber is money. So that's 1882. And then there's this guy, the Hall of Famer, John J. McGraw. John J. McGraw was with the New York Giants. He was back with the Baltimore Orioles way back when, during things when the Wee Willie Keeler days, the Baltimore Chop. Do you ever hear the Baltimore Chop anymore in baseball? Yes. When did you hear it? Yeah, I know, but do you ever hear it these days? You never. That's one of those things that's disappeared from the lexicon. But he was part of that. Now, McGraw was the manager of the New York Giants in 1905. There was no World Series in 1904 because McGraw's Giants won the National League pennant, and they decided we're not going to face the American League, Ban Johnson's league. McGraw didn't like Ban Johnson because Ban Johnson, he thought, when he was in the American League, didn't treat him well. Anyway, so 1905, Giants win the National League pennant again, and McGraw bets $400 on his team to win. He held out in 1904 against Boston. Johnson had suspended McGraw for on-field behavior while he was in the American League. Now think of this, the manager of the New York Giants bet $400 on the game, which I think in today's money would be roughly $25,000. $400 to bet on his team. Would he last today, or would he have been tossed? Well, he wasn't tossed. It was fine. 1908, the Giants team doctor tried to bribe another player so the Giants would win a game. The team doctor didn't lose his license, but was thrown out of baseball in 1908. McGraw agreed to take on the Philadelphia A's. The Giants beat the A's in 5 games. McGraw got his money. He was not thrown out of baseball for betting. He survived. In fact, it wasn't even brought up very much. Now, Jack O'Connor, he's the manager of the St. Louis Americans, and he drinks Coca-Cola. Ty Cobb drank Coca-Cola. Ty Cobb had stock in Coca-Cola. But no wonder he likes Coca-Cola. He liked Coca-Cola full of vim, vigor, and go. You'll like it. Delicious, refreshing, thirst-quenching. Anyway, Jack O'Connor and this guy, Harry Howell, tossed out of baseball permanently. They were involved in, O'Connor was the manager, Howell the coach, and they tried to fix the outcome of a game. Not necessarily the game, but they wanted to make sure that Nap Lajoie of the Cleveland Indians beat Ty Cobb in the batting race. So there were a number of things that were done. Harry Howell ordered his third baseman to play back, allowing LaJoie, and remember this is the dead ball era, to bunt up the third base line for hit after hit after hit. O'Connor and Howell also tried to bribe the official scorer, who was a woman. I never met a woman official scorer in all the years I was around baseball. Now there are, but when I was covering baseball in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, there was no official scorer. But anyway, they tried to bribe the official scorer, a woman, change one of the errors to a hit. And how'd they do it? Let's buy her a new wardrobe. We'll buy her clothes. For that, they were thrown out of baseball. Now, here's Arthur Rothstein, the brain, right? The guy who made a business out of organized crime. He organized everything, which is why it's called organized crime. He was the brain, he was the master, he was the guy who figured out how to make illegitimate business a business. Of course, he made all of his money on Prohibition, which also started in 1919, but really has nothing to do with the White Sox. That's Charles Comiskey. Comiskey was the owner of the White Sox, a former player who had a ballpark named after him, Comiskey Park. And here's the scheme. Chuck Gendel meets with Sport Sullivan to discuss the possibility in September of 1919 of the Sox players throwing the championship. Now, it has been known, or was known, and I've given you 40 years worth of history, even more so than 40 years, that gamblers and baseball players knew each other, and that if you got the right baseball player, you might be able to throw a game. All you had to do is come up with some cash. These guys were not making very much money. In fact, remember Babe Ruth in 1932? Somebody asked Babe Ruth in 1932, hey, you make more money than the President of the United States. He said, what the hell has this got to do with it? He said, besides, I had a better year than Hoover. So anyway, gamblers could get tips from players. Who's injured? Who might be on the take? Who's not feeling well? Gendel later claimed he wasn't sure that this thing could really work. But he managed to get a hold of a couple of people, co-conspirators, and they said, okay, we'll throw the World Series, you throw $100,000 our way, and everything will be fine. So he gets the players: Eddie Cicotti, Claude Lefty Williams, Charles Swede Risberg, Happy Felsch. Buck Weaver was involved in the early stages of the plot, but he pulled out. Fred McMullen was cut in after he heard the other players go ahead with the gamblers, and Shoeless Joe Jackson was approached. Now, it's hard, still after all these years, it's still hard to get evidence that Shoeless Joe Jackson was ever really involved with Sport Sullivan. He was supposedly involved with Sport Sullivan. He was also illiterate. So here's the crooks, a who's who of two-bit thugs: Sleepy Bill Burns, Bill Mahag, Abe Attell, who was a boxer back in the first decade of the 19th century. Now, Arthur Rothstein was too smart. He was the brain, after all. He may have been a major player, he may not have been a major player. We do know that Arthur Rothstein made a lot of money off of the fix in 1919. His involvement, never proven. The evidence suggests that Gendel and his co-conspirators, the other 7 White Sox players, may have hatched a number of deals with a number of crime syndicates. That's Attell. Attell becomes a key part of this whole thing, a former boxer hanging around Chicago. Now, Attell claims they not only sold the series, but they sold it wherever they could get a buck. Bookies had previously had the Sox winning the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds by about 3-1, the odds. The odds shifted after those in the quote-unquote no began putting a lot of cash on the Cincinnati Reds. This was not exactly a secret. None of this was a secret. In fact, in baseball, nothing was a secret. People kind of knew, going back to the 1860s, what was going on. Now, the other thing that I found reading about this, that possibly there was so much money that went into the White Sox-Reds World Series because of World War I, that you couldn't necessarily go to the track because the horses that would be at the track were used during World War I in 1917 and 1918 over in Europe. So there was a shortage of horses, particularly quality horses. So some of the money went over to baseball. And here they are. Fix these faces in your memory. 8 men charged with selling out baseball. But the funny thing all about that, everybody knew it, yet nobody did anything, and they stumbled upon it by accident. We're underway in Chicago, and Eddie Cicotti is on the mound for the home White Sox against the Cincinnati Reds, and the first batter that Cicotti faces, he hits. Allegedly a signal, hit by pitch, that the game's on, we're going to do what you said we should do, fix the games in exchange for money. That was uncharacteristic of Cicotti. He had pretty good control. Chicago loses game 1, 9-1. The New York Times in 1919 says, never before in the history of America's biggest spectacle. Sounds like Cosell, doesn't it? Spectacle? Our biggest spectacle. Has a pennant-winning club received such a disastrous drubbing in an opening game? They knew how to use words, the old sports writers in those days. They don't use those words today. Anyway, the next day, more faulty play. Lefty Williams loses 4-2, walks 3 batters in a row to help Cincinnati's cause. That's Christy Mathewson, the great pitcher for the New York Giants, who would ultimately succumb to tuberculosis because he went into World War I and worked in a chemical unit without any protection, and eventually would get tuberculosis, weakened lungs. He went to the Cincinnati Reds. He was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds in 16, 17, and 18 until he goes over to World War I. Christy Mathewson knows something is going on. The plot to throw the series, again, people knew. Players, sports writers, gamblers all hung out together. There was one guy, Hy Fullerton, of the Chicago Herald and Examiner, a Hearst newspaper, and Christy Mathewson. They had it all figured out. Fullerton then eventually would go up to old Roman, Comiskey, and say, what's going on here? Are these games fixed? And Comiskey says, nope. Later it comes out that the players hadn't been paid by Game 5. The $100,000 isn't there, so Games 6 and 7 were on the level. One of the games in the first 5 games was pitched by Dickie Kerr. Dickie Kerr was not involved in any of the stuff. Now, it was best 5 of 9. The longer the series went, the more money the players were going to get. It used to be the players would get just a cut of whatever the receipts were, fixed amount, but all of a sudden they changed it for 1919 in baseball. Game 8 comes around. The series is 4-3, Cincinnati at that point. And apparently one of the gamblers threatened to kill Williams and his wife if the White Sox won Game 8. The pitcher threw the game, allegedly, and the series. So here are the champions, the 1919 Cincinnati Reds. They did have a good baseball team. And they're the champions. Okay, season is over, we go home, and yeah, there are some rumors here and there, but nobody decides to look into anything. Now, what were the reasons for the fix? Well, Comiskey was known as a skinflint. He didn't pay his players well, except only New York and Boston had bigger payrolls in the American League in 1919. He charged the players for cleaning their uniforms. That is where the Black Sox name comes from. Not the fact that they threw the World Series, but their uniforms were dirty. Cicotti was promised a $5,000 bonus if he won 30 games that year. He won 29. He was benched. Comiskey denied him the bonus. Players had meager salaries, and that left some players open to gamblers who are willing to stuff their pockets with $10,000, $15,000, or $20,000. Big money in 1919. Now, during the trial, or before the trial, Eddie Siccardi in 1920, after he's suspended, in his deposition, says that the 1919 White Sox players had heard of bribe offers of $10,000 to one or more of the Chicago Cubs players in the 1918 World Series between the Red Sox and the Cubs. Now, if you remember the pitcher Babe Ruth was with the Boston Red Sox. Babe Ruth held until Whitey Ford beat the record in 1961, the most consecutive innings thrown without giving up a run in World Series history. Now, it's never been proven in any way, shape, or form whether the Chicago Cubs threw the 1918 World Series. Of course, if they didn't and they won, there'd be no Curse of the Bambino, would there? And we'd lose that in baseball lore. But there were suspicions, some suspicions, about the 1918 World Series. Here's Rothstein. Somehow Rothstein is not involved. Rothstein would go on to other sports betting and other sports scandals, including the 1921 Travers Stakes up at Saratoga, which may or may not have been fixed by Arthur Rothstein. He wasn't ever proven to be involved. He was asked to finance the bribery. He refused, but he knew all about it because he made $350,000 betting on the Cincinnati Reds, which comes out to today's money probably about $5-6 million. So he knew what was going on. He was probably smart enough not to leave any fingerprints anywhere. He would eventually die at the poker game because he didn't pay off the debt. That was about 9 years later. The investigation centered around Abe Attell, the old Chicago fighter. He was a friend and an employee of Rothstein's. I guess, what would be on Attell's business card? Fixer? Anyway, he was involved in making the payments to the players, but Rothstein said, I wouldn't do this. He was never indicted. And so the 1920 season starts. Series had been fixed. Rothstein, Attell, and others never gave anyone a straight story. The fix was uncovered by accident. Despite the fact that there were all kinds of suspicions and rumors that it was fixed, the 1919 World Series, like the 1969 Mets, faded into oblivion. But there was a game between the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies that drew some interest by a grand jury, and they decided to look in whether or not the 1920 one game between the Cubs and Phillies was fixed. But all of a sudden, there was some other evidence that the grand jury got, and they turned their attention. The gambler, Bill Morag, went public with an account of his own involvement in the fix, and all of a sudden the grand jury indicts, and there's a trial. Eddie Siccardi, great pitcher, 29 wins, 1919, testified before the grand jury. I don't know why I did it. I needed the money. I had a wife and kids. Shortly afterwards, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was functionally illiterate, admitted to accept $5,000 from his teammates, but he had a great World Series in 1919. That doesn't make sense. But anyway, Shoeless Joe Jackson said, I took $5,000. Lefty Williams, Hap Felsch also confessed their involvement. And on October 22nd, 1920, the grand jury handed down the indictment. 8 Chicago players, 5 gamblers, Bill Burns, Sport Sullivan, Abe Attell. No Arnold Rothstein. The indictments included 9 counts of conspiracy to defraud various individuals and institutions. Who were they defrauding? Major League Baseball at that time. Although it wasn't called Major League Baseball, it was the National League and the American League. The judge in the case, Hugo Friend, charged the jury. He told them to return a guilty verdict. They must find the players conspired to defraud the public and others and not merely to throw games. Maybe with that instruction, maybe because of the instruction, the jury came back on August 2nd, 1921. None of them found guilty. Maybe they could go back to Major League Baseball, but there's a new sheriff in town. A guy who had helped baseball in the 19-teens with the Federal League, and eventually baseball would get an antitrust exemption as they went through the courts. And one of the judges that they found going through the Federal League case and the Baltimore Terrapins case, which ended up giving Major League Baseball the antitrust exemption, was a judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He was recently, at 1920, appointed as the commissioner of baseball, and he was there to clean up the game. And his decree was all 8 of those guys were to be permanently banned from baseball. And there's Landis. Landis was a lot of things. He restored some law and order in baseball, but he did a number of other things that didn't exactly help baseball along, including not fighting for Negro players to get into the major leagues. That's Landis. Regardless of the verdict, Landis wrote, no player who throws a game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play baseball again. It wasn't just the Chicago White Sox 8 players that got tossed out. Maybe 10 men out. 8 men out. There's number 9, Joe Gideon. Joe Gideon was a player with the St. Louis Browns who happened to be friends with Swede Reisberg. And he was present while the players were talking with gamblers, discussing how they were going to fix the 1919 World Series. He was called as a witness in the trial. On November 3rd, 1921, Gideon was banned for life from organized baseball for having guilty knowledge of the Black Sox scandal. So that is the 9th man out. Papers relating to the players' grand jury confessions somehow vanished. Where is Joe Friday when you need him? Well, he would come 30 years later. Did Comiskey and Arnold Rothstein arrange for the papers to be stolen as part of a cover-up? The prosecution's case disappeared. They couldn't find it. It's gone, along with the confessions, never to have been found. In 1956, Gendell gave an interview where he did say, I was the ringleader of it, the 8 men out. 1920, September, here's the chronology. September 28th, 1920, Comiskey suspends the players. Landis becomes the commissioner on November 11th, 1920. Not the last betting scandal by any means. Gendell tells Sports Illustrated, I'm the ringleader. They were all interested and thought we should recontour to see if the dough would really be put on the line. Weaver suggested we get paid in advance. Then if things got too hot, we could double-cross the gambler, keep the cash, and take the big end of the series by beating the Reds. We all agreed this was a brainy plan. They're all gone. So was he after the 1919 season. He had nothing to do with the fixing of the World Series. Hal Chase. Over the years, Hal Chase, great hitter during his 15 years. After the 1919 season, he was playing with the New York Giants. He was banned from the major leagues. Suspicion of gambling. He was also officially banned from the Pacific Coast League, where some players actually made more money than the American and National League, for, among other things, bribing an umpire. So he is 10 man out, and then there's the 11th man out. The Giant teammate, the Triple Crown winner, Heine Zimmerman, was barred from baseball after the 1919 season for fixing games. 11th man out. So all of a sudden there are 11 guys out, and this guy comes to New York. How he got to New York? Well, he was a bad boy in Boston. You know, Major League Baseball last year actually thought about making a show about Babe Ruth to appeal to young people, because young people don't like baseball anymore, or not in the numbers that they used to. And they were going to do a show called Babe Ruth, Bad Boy. all the bad things about him to make him cool to the generation that they are seeking to watch baseball. But anyway, the Babe all of a sudden is traded to New York. He was a bad boy. Harry Frazee needed some money for no-no in the net, so the Babe ends up with the Yankees and is credited with saving baseball after the scandal. One reporter said about Babe Ruth, "This new fan didn't know where first base was, but he heard of Babe Ruth and he wanted to see him hit a home run. When the Babe hit one, the fan went back the next day and knew not only where first base was, but where second base was as well." The Babe became bigger than baseball. The Babe was up there with Al Jolson and Red Grange and Rudolph Valentino in the 1920s. He was bigger than baseball. He was bigger than life. He also made more money than Herbert Hoover in 1932. Had a better year. This is another guy who got suspended as well, Gene Paulette. 12th man out. He was suspended from baseball. He received gifts from St. Louis gamblers in 1919 and offered to throw some games in 1919, the year that the Chicago White Sox players allegedly threw the World Series. Another guy, Jimmy O'Connell. Now, you would think after 1919, 1920, some of these guys would learn that maybe they shouldn't go, even though they're not making much money, maybe they should stay away from gamblers. Final series of the 1924 season, the Giants playing the Philadelphia Phillies at the Polo Grounds. They're battling for the pennant with the Brooklyn Dodgers. O'Connor goes up to the Philadelphia shortstop, Heine Sand. Here's $500 to throw the games. Sam rejected the bribe, reported it to Art Fletcher, the manager of the Phillies. It led to a lifelong suspension of not only O'Connell, but Giants coach Cozy Dolan by Landis. There were others that were thought to maybe be part of this, like Frankie Frisch, George Kelly, and Russ Youngs. Of course, Frankie Frisch, the Fordham Flash, is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And then there was Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker in 1926. Apparently, they had some action in 1919. Cobb and Speaker were permitted by Ban Johnson, the president of the American League, to resign from baseball. Resign from baseball. They weren't thrown out. They were allowed to resign. Well, Ty Cobb could have made money sitting at home from Coca-Cola. Near the end of the 1926 season, a former pitcher, Dutch Leonard, said that Cobb, Speaker, and Smokey Joe Wood joined him before the 1919 World Series betting on the games because they knew in 1919 that was fixed. Leonard sent letters and other documents to Ban Johnson. Johnson thought they would be so potentially damaging to baseball 7 years after the White Sox that he paid Leonard $20,000 to get rid of the letters. The verdict, Landis exposed the cover-up, and the eventual fallout had Johnson ousted as the American League president. Cobb and Speaker said they didn't do anything wrong. Landis brought them back into baseball because they had not been found guilty of fixing any games, although they bet on it. And Ty Cobb said that he actually won money the only time he ever bet on baseball during the 1919 World Series. Now, this guy in the middle is Bill Cox, William Cox, and he is the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies in 1943, and they're at spring training in 1943, and he is the last guy to have been banned in baseball for betting prior to Pete Rose. Cox was the owner of the team. He bet on his team's games. He would eventually come back in the 1960s and try to start a soccer league. He's buried over here in Mount Kisco. So he tried to start a soccer league in the 1960s and failed. But he's the last guy before Pete Rose. Actually, that's not quite true. There's Willie and there's Mickey. You know, they were suspended from baseball, right? They were suspended from baseball. That's 1962, and that is in Candlestick Park during the World Series, the Mick and Willie. 1979, Willie Mays signed as an ambassador of the Steve Wynn's Casino in Atlantic City. Mickey Mantle joined him at Steve Wynn's Casino in Atlantic City in 1983. Each was paid $100,000. Now you got to remember, Mickey didn't really have a salary in those days, nor did Willie, so they were looking for jobs. Bowie Kuhn, who eventually, Bowie Kuhn would form a law firm with Harvey Meyerson, who was the USFL attorney in the NFL-USFL antitrust suit in 1986. Eventually, the Kuhn-Meyerson law firm would go belly up. Meyerson would go to jail. Bowie Kuhn fled to Florida, trying not to be conspicuous. He was last seen in New York pulling papers out of his office. Anyway, Kuhn said that the appearance of them hanging out with gamblers was not good. And he got rid of Willie and Mickey, which meant Mickey couldn't go to old-timers games and drink with his old Yankee teammates. That's basically what that was about. Now that's Peter Ueberroth. Peter and I didn't get along. We were not the best of friends, although he did buy me and my wife dinner one day at the Scottsdale Doubletree in 1994 when I told my wife, I said, he owns this Doubletree. And then Peter said, and she said, you own this Doubletree? He said, I own all the Doubletrees. Guy was all the ego. Anyway, so Ueberroth takes over 1984. And he decides one of the first things he needs to look at is whether or not Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle should be banned from baseball. They're banned from baseball, although they were both in the Hall of Fame. There's literally nothing there. They played golf at casino sponsors' outings as celebrities. They were on casino boulevards, but promoting golf events, not gambling. Not even a close call. No umpire needed. And Peter reinstored them to baseball. But Peter had a bigger problem on his hands, a much bigger problem. Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose. Now, when I started covering baseball, it was about 1978, 1979, and Dick Wagner was the general manager of the Cincinnati Reds. And there was a story that floated around baseball in the late 1970s before Pete went to Philadelphia in 1980, that Dick Wagner's biggest nightmare in his life was one day he was going to wake up and find Pete Rose dead because of gambling. Joe Nuxhall once talked about Pete Rose. Nuxhall was the youngest player ever to appear in Major League Baseball at the age of 15 in 1944. He was the Cincinnati Reds announcer. And we were just talking about Pete one day, and he says, you know, it's a good thing Pete never got stuck in the escalator at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in New York. Because if he did, he wouldn't know whether to go up or down. So Pete wasn't exactly very brainy, and he hung out with some unsavory characters, including a guy by the name of Paul Jansen. But Pete was great on the baseball field. His nickname given to him by Whitey Ford, Charlie Hustle, and it was probably an apropos nickname. The Major League Baseball Rule 21D. Any umpire, any player or club or league official or employee who shall bet any sum whatsoever on any baseball game in connection which the bettor has a duty to perform shall be declared permanently ineligible. That was the rule that tripped up Pete Rose in 1989. I had interviewed Pete Rose in spring training of 1989 down in Plant City, Florida. Didn't seem anything was wrong. We didn't know at that time that Peter Ueberroth was monitoring Pete. And Peter Ueberroth was leaving his job, tossed out of baseball for a little thing called collusion that would bite baseball in the back about 3 years later because he suggested all the owners should not bid for players to keep down salaries. And in 1990, an arbitrator found in favor of the players. It was Peter Ueberroth's fault. But anyway, Pete Rose. Pete Rose is being investigated, and Bart Giamatti takes over as commissioner of baseball. His assistant is Fay Vincent. And their number one problem in 1989 is not collusion, but Pete Rose. They know he's betting. They think they could prove that he's betting on games. He's the manager of the Cincinnati Reds at the time. However, there was no evidence ever discovered that Rose bet against the Cincinnati Reds, his team. But Rose's betting slips, written in his own handwriting, as well as other evidence, indicate he only bet on certain Reds games. Now, I had a friend named Bobby G, who worked at Sports Phone at the time. Sports Phone, I don't know if you remember Sports Phone or not, 976-1212, that was the number. And you called and they gave you all the games. The New York Yankee Public Relations Director at that time, Joe Safety, called it a conduit for bettors. He was absolutely correct. Pete Rose had the inside line at Sports Phone and would call up on specific games. They got to know Pete on a first name basis. They couldn't figure out why Pete was asking about this game, that game, that game, this game. But Bobby G said, he's a hell of a nice guy. Never, ever, ever led on to that he was betting on baseball. But he bet on the Reds. Rose was informally questioned in February 1989 by Uberoth. I saw him in March of 1989 in Plant City. Nothing was going on. And also Giamatti. Rose vehemently denied the allegations. This time, Giamatti takes over, and Uberoth says, you deal with it. He's gone. Sports Illustrated gives the first detailed report of the allegations that Rose placed bets on baseball games, March 21st, 1989. That is the insufferable John Dowd. I call him insufferable because I dealt with John Dowd, and he was one of the most unpleasant people I ever dealt with in terms of reporting. He was absolutely convinced that Pete Rose was the devil, and he was out to get him. That's John Dowd. Dowd would give these news conferences after he interviewed people like Paul Janssens, who was Pete Rose's mate when they were working out. Also bookies and bet runners. He delivers his summary of his findings to Giamatti in May 1989. Now, baseball had known that Rose was hanging out with unsavory people for a very, very long time and did nothing about it. Dowd documented Rose's alleged activities gambling in 1985, 1986, a day-by-day account of Rose's alleged betting on baseball games in 1987 when he was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds. 52 games Rose bet on. In 1987, wagered a minimum of $10,000 a day. I was told by people who grew up in the Pete Rose neighborhood, because we're interviewing everybody at that time in 1989 about Rose, that betting was a way of life where Pete Rose grew up, and that he didn't see anything wrong with it, he being Pete, continuing what he did as a kid, which was betting. Or he'd go over the river to Kentucky and bet. Rose kept denying, saying, nope, not me. Dowd kept saying, yes. Rose eventually would sue baseball, would end up in the Hamilton County Commission Court. He was looking for an injunction so he can continue his managing of the Reds. The night before, we were at a party, a baseball party in New York at one of the hotels, and Giamatti was there. And Giamatti was explaining, we will see what we will see in court tomorrow. He also gave Steve Levy, who's then with Channel 2, now with ESPN, a total dressing down, a 25-minute civics dissertation about what you do in court and what you can and can't say outside of court that day. Giamatti was a tough guy, smart guy too. But they were out to get Pete, and they were going to make sure they got him. Pete Rose agreed to a lifetime ban from Major League Baseball on August 23rd, 1989. I was there. I covered it. Why did he have a ban? Well, he figured he was going to get back in baseball. But there was another thing. Major League Baseball says, we're going to ban you permanently, but we're not going to say whether you bet on anything or not. Rose was pretty convinced that he'd sit out a year or two and then would be back in baseball. Giamatti would drop dead about 6 days later. Fay Vincent became commissioner, and he carried Bart's torch, and really carried Bart's torch, to the point where he wouldn't even want to talk about Pete Rose. Did Pete Rose kill Bart Giamatti? Possibly. Maybe 5 packs of cigarettes a day also killed Giamatti. Giamatti was a tough guy, really tough guy. You always question why you're asking a question. But Rose is on the outside looking in. And there he is, the hit king. 4,192 hits. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle. He would kind of get back into baseball a little bit. In 1999, he's named to one of the all-time greatest 20th century teams. But he lost his eligibility to go into the Hall of Fame. The debate remains. Should he go into the Hall of Fame as just a player and put on his plaque permanently suspended from baseball for gambling? He was on Fox TV for a little while on baseball. It's Roger Kahn. Roger Kahn actually wrote a book about Pete Rose in 1989. And Kahn, Pete Rose, my story, said he repeatedly asked Rose, "Did you bet on baseball?" And Kahn said, "I have too much respect for the game." After the book came out, Rose told an interviewer, "Yes, I did bet on baseball." Kahn said, "I wanted to vomit." He also wrote The Boys of Summer, Roger Kahn. Now I'm going to switch a couple sports here. The CCNY team. How many of you used to go up to the Borscht Belt, to Kutchers or Grossingers, or the Pines, or Brickman, or Browns, or Grossingers, or Concord? How many of you used to do that? Because the epicenter of basketball was the Catskills in the 1950s in the summer. The bad guys, the gamblers, were always up there, and they got the CCNY team, and they paid off some players to throw games with CCNY. 32 college basketball players, 7 schools around the country caught in a point-shaving scheme for the schools. New York, 3 of these schools were out of state, including Kentucky. The players had been on the CCNY 1950 team, which was the first and only team ever to win the NCAA and NIT championships. The NFL, Paul Hornung, Alex Karras, Pete Rozelle. Karras and Hornung were betting, Karras with the Detroit Lions at the time and Hornung with the Green Bay Packers. And I'm not sure when he had the time because he was also in the military reserve at that point and coming in and kicking on weekends for the Packers in 1962. Anyway, they were suspended for 1 year. They came clean, and Pete Rozelle allowed them to come back. They were betting about $500 a week with known gamblers. Rozelle said neither player bet on or against his own teams. His suspension was dropped after the 1963 season. Another one I covered, Tim Donahue, NBA, David Stern. David Stern, who is meticulous in everything he does, one of the smartest people I've ever met, one of the guys who could be called one of my mentors because when I do the politics of sports business, David Stern told me exactly how sports business operates. Government, cable TV, corporate, you need everything from government, regulates taxes on corporate, also regulates cable TV. That was David Stern's contribution to me, and then one day he said to me, "I've created a monster." I said, "Live with it." By the way, if you want to see David, you go down to a deli in Scarsdale. He's there every Friday morning. His father owned a deli in Manhattan. He kind of feels like he needs to be in the deli, so he's there every Friday morning in Scarsdale. Anyway, Donahue was a rogue ref, or was he a rogue ref? He got involved with gamblers. He was refereeing games. He had a system where he worked out fixes by calling fouls. And he would call the gamblers and say, "This is what I'm doing," and he was nabbed. In 2007, there was an FBI investigation, not an NBA investigation, an FBI investigation of Donahue that he bet on NBA games and fed information to other gamblers. He fell into debt, and that's what got him eventually. Donahue would go to jail. It's Connie Hawkins. Connie Hawkins before there was Dr. J, Julius Erving, before there was Michael Jordan. There was Connie Hawkins, who may have been the best of all of them. Connie Hawkins was going to school in Iowa. He was from Brooklyn. He was born in 1942. He's going to school in Iowa in 1960, and he is caught hanging around Jack Molinas. Molinas was one of the guys who fixed basketball up in the Catskills back in the 1950s. He just hung around him, and for that he got thrown out of school, and the NBA said never again. So he's booted from the University of Iowa after testifying in the 1961 point-shaving case. He was not charged with anything except hanging out with the wrong people at the wrong time. He never played one game at Iowa. He ended up in the American Basketball League and then the Harlem Globetrotters, and he would get back into the National Basketball Association in 1968-69. He had played in the American Basketball Association for 2 years. My friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who just passed away a month ago, was a part owner of the Phoenix Suns. They had lost the NBA draft. First pick, which was Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and they were looking for a player, and they told Connie, you're doing the $6 million antitrust suit against the NBA, we'll pay for it. The Suns paid for it. All of a sudden, the NBA got wind that the Suns were paying for his lawsuit, and they said, Connie, you're welcome to come in the league. They wanted no part of that lawsuit. The other guys who were also tossed in '61, Doug Moe, who ended up with a long, long NBA career as a coach and then a broadcaster, Roger Brown, who never played in the American National Basketball Association. He played in the American Basketball Association in Indianapolis, eventually would become a law enforcement person. All ended up in the American Basketball Association. They were banned by J. Walter Kennedy, the NBA commissioner. Brown and Hawkins are both in the Hall of Fame in Springfield. You know who this guy is? Henry Hill? Goodfellas. So you know who he is, right? Henry Hill. He's in the middle of a college basketball scandal in 1978. There was a Dixie Classic down in the South in 1961, ended because of point shaving. Boston College. Basketball point shaving scandal, 78-79. Henry Hill is one of the ringleaders. Tulane men's basketball point shaving, 84-85. The university got rid of its basketball team for 4 years. Now, Henry Hill, he was born in 1943. He worked his way up in the Lucchese crime family from a young age. He was arrested for drug trafficking in 1980. He goes into the Federal Witness Protection Program. Hill's life is the basis of the Goodfellas movie. Henry Hill, who is involved in one of those things. Now, it's legalized sports gambling today. Supreme Court last year, May of 2018, ruled in favor of New Jersey. New Jersey had been looking to legalize sports gambling since 2011. They kept losing and losing in court, and finally the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can have legalized sports gambling. That opens the door for not only New Jersey, but other states. And all of a sudden, legalized sports gambling is so bad. The states that went in, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Rhode Island joining Nevada. Sports gambling's really bad. There's Chris Christie, who went after sports gambling. New Jersey tried to do it. The NFL blocked it by going to court a few times. And then finally, in 2018, they got there. Why did New Jersey want sports gambling? Well, part of it to boost Atlantic City's economy, which is awful. They also saw what Nevada used to do on Super Bowl Sunday, making over $150 million that day on betting, and they wanted a piece of it. Now, it's so bad gambling, it is so bad for organized sports that MGM becomes the official gaming partner of Major League Baseball. So gambling's okay, right? It's all fine. You know, the NHL has a deal. The NBA has a bunch of deals. The NBA thinks that sports gambling is going to attract more people to games, more interest to games. It may have worked this year in the NFL as people came back to television. It is so bad that let's make some money off of it. But there still remains the possibility either college kids or minor league baseball players could get involved in some 1919 type thing. The minor leagues. Now, it's more likely it'll be college because the college kids need money and the games would be more widespread than it would be in minor league baseball because, let's face it, when Binghamton is playing, whenever Binghamton AA baseball, whoever they're playing, whether it's Hagerstown or somebody like that, there are not going to be too many people interested in betting on Binghamton baseball. But Pat O'Connor is the head of minor league baseball. You're an A-ball. You got a nice bonus, but you're making $2,000 a month, and the guy comes to you and says, hey kid, just the first pitch. Throw the first pitch outside, that's all you need to do. You're gonna throw 100 more pitches before the night's out. Just make sure the first one's outside. And that's O'Connor, who runs minor league baseball. Okay, you may not affect the outcome of the game, but now you're owned. You're owned. And the next time he comes back, it may be something more. It may be more money. It may be more egregious offense. But you're owned. A young, an impressionable kid is not going to know he needs to be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his career or his life. When you're in the position where this may be my last year and I've never had a good payday, someone offers me something. I'm not saying they would. And I would like to pray to God they won't. But it's a real threat. I don't think it's a threat in minor league baseball. I really don't think it's a threat in minor league baseball. But in college basketball, more so than college football, where you only need one guy or two guys for point shaving, it's a threat. And college basketball has seen it repeatedly. There's probably way too much money in Major League Baseball now. When you see guys like Harper and Trout and Machado get all those hundreds of millions of dollars, 3 players, over $1 billion for 3 players, probably you're not going to see it in baseball. You probably won't see it in the NFL. They're making too much money. Basketball, college, hockey, but there is fixing going on, allegedly. It's in international soccer in Europe and also tennis. There are investigations of those right now going on. Could the 1919 World Series happen again? Probably not. Again, too much money involved. Could it happen, say, in tennis? Sure. Could it happen in golf? Sure. All you need is one individual. Thank you.
You're watching Lewisboro Community Television, Channel 20.